Knuckle Balled. Written by Stepek. Read by Jason Hill. For Lisa, the one who keeps me Drew, grounded somewhere between Andy and RJ. Children of the Night. Children of the Night is a private, non-profit, tax-exempt organization founded in 1979. They are dedicated to assisting children between the ages of 11 and 17 who are forced to prostitute on the streets for food to eat and a place to sleep. They have rescued girls and boys from prostitution and the domination of vicious pimps, and they provide all programs with the support of private donations. They are making a difference in the lives of hundreds of children each year. Their commitment to rescuing these children from the ravages of prostitution is shared with a small but committed group of detectives, FBI agents, and prosecutors in Los Angeles, Hollywood, Santa Ana, Anaheim, San Diego, other areas of California, Las Vegas, Portland, Billings, Montana, Seattle, Washington, Miami, New York, Minneapolis, Atlanta, Phoenix, Hawaii, and Washington, D.C. All stops in the child prostitution circuit, and their numbers keep growing as more and more dedicated individuals become concerned about the welfare of these desperate children. Child prostitutes require specialized care for effective intervention. Most of the children victimized by prostitution were first victimized by a parent or early caregiver. Most have been tortured by treacherous pimps, and many testify in lengthy court proceedings against the pimps who have forced them to work as prostitutes. In most cases, these children do not have appropriate homes to return to, and the only relative who is a suitable guardian may live far away from the child's hometown. For many, the only option is an out-of-home placement, college dorm, maternity home, or mental health program. For those who reach 18 and need additional time to prepare to enter the mainstream society, independent living programs are recommended. Special education programs are advised for those who need extra help with school, and alcohol or drug recovery homes are suggested for those with substance abuse problems. Children of the Night is in demand to assist other agencies across the country and around the world to develop similar programs. You can find out more at www.childrenofthenight.org. Up to 10% of the revenue from Knuckle Supper will be donated to the Children of the Night. Forward. I'll never forget my first encounter with a punk vampire. I was about 13 years old at the time, and I'd found an only slightly battered copy of John Skipp and Craig Spector's 1986 opus, The Light at the End. I also managed to get my hands on a copy of Ray Garton's Live Girls around that time, but that's a story for another day. Back when I was consuming vampire literature with a hunger that bordered on rapacious, I had already burned through more titles than I can list, including Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire and its grislier heir apparent, S.P. Somtow's rock and roll bloodsucker yarn, Vampire Junction. Both of those novels primed the pump for Skipp and Spector's gory trip through a gritty and surreal New York City underworld. But the vamp that lurked in Light's pages was far removed from Rice's introspective Lestat and Somtow's charismatic Timmy Valentine. Rudy Pascal was a Nosferatu for the age of splatterpunk, an all-too-human predator who lived on blood but thrived on degradation, rape, and brutal, frenzied murder. So, I'd like to think I was more prepared than most when I picked up Drew Stepek's Knuckle Supper back in 2011. I didn't know much about the book before I read it, only that it was about a punk vampire in Los Angeles, and that it was a response to the Twilight novels and their ilk. I assumed Drew didn't care for the brooding neck-botherers that were rubbing their sparky bits all over the bestseller list, and that he meant to put the bite back in vampire fiction. What Drew saw in those books, though, was something far more upsetting. The problem wasn't that we romanticized vampires, he argued. It was that we turned them into pedophiles. Knuckle Supper, then, pushed vampire literature into territory that was far more disturbing than any bloodsucker tale I'd experienced before. It wasn't the gore that I found so unsettling. I cut my teeth on Faust comics and other underground horror fare in the 80s, so I've seen some things, man. What got me about Knuckle's supper was the desperate plight of the character at its center, a murderous vampire junkie named R.J. Reynolds, and a 12-year-old, very human prostitute known as Bait. If you're reading these words, it's probably not a spoiler to say that Bait's story didn't end well. R.J., though, well, R.J. is complicated. He might still have a shot. I won't condescend to warn you about the gruesomeness you're going to encounter in Knuckle Balled. If you've found your way here, I think it's safe to say your taste in horror runs considerably left of center, and you've probably got a stomach to match. The same goes for profoundly disturbing content. It is, after all, a story about unspeakable abuse visited upon children. Most of that is kept off the page, but a few lines land like a kick in the teeth, as they should. Drew looks into the darkest corners you can imagine, and he doesn't flinch. On Drew Stepek. And yet, you knew there was an "and yet," right? RJ's story isn't entirely one of degradation and despair. I'll admit I've lost my taste for horror that doesn't offer at least a few thin rays of hope and humor, and you'll find both running through Knuckle Balled. RJ is no Lestat, but he's no Rudy Pascoe either. His novelty in the world of counterculture vampire fiction isn't that he's a remorseless, bloodthirsty killer, or that he's a monster struggling to maintain some semblance of his humanity. It's that he's both. April Snelling's Rue Morgue. Just 'cause you got that monkey off your back doesn't mean the circus has left town. George Carlin. Chapter 1. Voiced. My name is RJ, and I'm a drug addict. Like a shitty nar-anon meeting on some preachy episode of T.J. Hooker, that's the way my nightmare always began. My subconscious was forcing me into rehab to face the consequences of my choices. These choices, the ones that resulted in Bates' death, ate away at my body from the tip of my toes all the way to the longest strand of hair sticking up on my head. I'm a bad man. I'm a selfish man. Although I'm not technically a vampire, who's to say that I'm not some form of vampire? By form of vampire, I mean a Hail Mary abortion kept alive by a perverted Catholic sect called the Cloth, who crossed their arms and shook their heads at my junkie mother's right to choose. The fact was this. I was alive. I needed blood. And heroin. In the dream, which I'm not sure I can call a dream because I'm not technically certain I was asleep, I would find myself planted in the middle of a circle of plastic junior high quality assembly chairs. The meeting didn't take place in a junior high, however. It took place in the torched remains of the gymnasium, where I was brought to life by way of an incubator, steroids, and a constant drip of narcotics. That was how the lovely cunt at St. Matthew's fed me to instill my addiction. I grabbed tightly onto the chair that seemed to be ass-fucking me as I pinched my finger on a screw that was coming loose. I felt like the center of the seat contained a makeshift dildo, fabricated from the same uncomfortable plastic utilitarian chair materials as the base. I cleared my throat, making certain that everyone heard my plea for forgiveness. Ahem. My name is RJ, and I'm a heroin addict. Everyone in the circle around me just seemed angry. The dream cast always featured a filthy assortment of assholes and unfortunate collateral damage who would turn my walking abortion life upside down. To my right was a dirty pig of a man in a Roman Catholic vestment, masturbating into the face of a little boy in a sailor outfit as he chugged fetuses from a giant beer stein. To my left was a cracked-out slut who was birthing lifeless children from her gash, one right after another, strung together by umbilical cords as if she were processing macabre sausages. My conscience had a funny way of grabbing a bullhorn and yelling into my ear, "Hey, dickhead! You're worse than every living and unlikable piece of shit in this room. Remember, this is the room where you were crapped out of your druggy mother's ass. This is the room where you were sentenced to walk the earth as an unloving and uncaring shell of normality." I pleaded for acceptance into their cult of sobriety. Still, no one responded. I wanted to be welcomed into their world of the living. Surely I wasn't as bad as Father McAteer, who was located halfway around the circle and was much more preoccupied with polishing and placing a diamond ring onto the skeletal finger of his last victim. I mean, he brought me and all the other abortions in Los Angeles to life because he wanted to stop the mass prostitute abortions on the streets of LA. That's pretty bad. Again, my name is RJ and I'm a heroin addict. I tried to stand up and extract revenge on them for ignoring me. Who were they to sit and judge? I was better than all of them. I didn't have a problem. Unlike them, I was forced to live like this. I didn't ask for it. If I had my way, that piece of shit mother of mine would have shoved a vacuum up her twat and sucked me out before I fell into the hands of McAteer and the cloth. How dare they look down their noses at me? Sure, I've killed several hundred humans, including half vampire people. So what? And yeah, sometimes I killed people for the fun of it. But mostly I killed because I needed that sweet, warm nectar in their bodies. I needed to stay alive. And get high. Killer or victim? Which one was I? After literally crawling out of a dumpster in my teens, the only way for me to stay alive was to feed my hunger. My hunger. My everything. My loving heroin. The only love of my sad half-life. The itches and sweats intensified as they continued to ignore me. I felt so debilitated in the dream that I vomited cotton balls, then tried to pound them back into my corroded mouth with my fist. Ashamed. I was ashamed of my existence. Not even those derelicts who sat on their high horses would get the chance to point and laugh at what was left of me, broken into 1,000 pieces of waste on the inside and filled to the brim with darkness, regret, and sadness. That was what was left of R.J. Reynolds, badass vampire, heroin addict, gangster motherfucker. I got your back. A baritone whisper vibrated my eardrum. I turned to see King Cobra standing next to me. His voice was warped by one of those awful steel collars that the cloth used to control us when we were in captivity. It was just a week ago, when it felt like years. They forced us to eliminate all the other vampire gangs in L.A. I escaped the vice of the collar. Cobra didn't. I wanted to tell him how much he meant to me. He was the biggest threat to my drug-dealing operation, and I despised his fascist rule of the streets. Thing was, I never got the chance to enjoy the alliance we formed after we were kidnapped by the cloth because... At Stringo Gutter! A voice screamed from the other side of me. Well, because that happened. The dream and the wish of getting the chance to spend more time with King Cobra left me as the collar tightened and squeezed the contents of his head out all over my shoulder. I know who spoke the cloth's magic phrase. It was the Habit, the awful teeny-bopper actress who had outlived her appeal, turned heroin addict and then nun mercenary for a pack of vampire exterminators. She lifted her repulsive nun's habit. It's a habit. Get it, RJ? And started fingering herself. Small fetuses dropped to her filthy toes. I know you want to get inside this shit. There might have been a time when I wanted to fuck her, but that was long ago. Mostly, I wanted to keep off the streets by living in her heroin den. Now even that house was gone.
Too bad none of your vampire scum can get a hard-on, she reminded me.
That was the truth. A lot of us cheated the fact that we didn't have enough blood in our bodies to get aroused by using a syringe full of blood and some crushed-up Viagra. She limped away into the dark, leaving a trail of unborn babies in her wake. And then, just as I stood up and was about to grab an arm bong and my rig and leave those dreadful monsters, another voice rang out, like a news story soundbite from a murder scene. "She's dead, motherfucker! I kept her alive because I knew you'd be back. I wanted you to see me kill her, you piece of shit!" I sat down and closed my eyelids. I didn't want to look up and see who was sitting across from me in the circle of horrible creatures. I told myself it was only a stupid dream, but the voice fought louder than my attempts to reel myself back to reality. It spelled out my greatest failure. It reminded me of the worst thing that I'd ever done that sat on top of a mountain of blood-drained corpses. The failure waved a flag from atop its mountain and insisted that there would never be a way to correct this wrong. It was beyond a lack of judgment. It was beyond taking the left path to damnation, rather than the right one towards salvation. It could never be fixed, and it could never be rewritten. It was worse than taking human life for pleasure. With my head down, I sat there and debated whether or not to further confront the demons that I'd conjured up. For some reason, all I could think about was killing that lump of human feces to my right, the pedophile priest, and sucking what was left of his barren existence from his knuckles. After all, that was my justification for killing pimps, gangsters, child molesters, and the accumulated dirt on the streets of Los Angeles. Wasn't it? They didn't have any right to live. A rat scurried by my bare feet. Rather than looking up and facing myself in a mirror of misery, I watched it circle around my legs in a figure eight. I refused to give any further attention to the pedophile or the welfare check assembly line on the other side of me. And I definitely didn't want to catch a glimpse of the horror tragedy across the room from me that I had created. I snatched up the rat. Trying not to draw attention to myself, I rolled open my leather syringe case with my calloused heel. Using my big toe and broken and bent second toe, I clinched onto a needle's plunger and pulled it out of the case. With my other foot, I exchanged direction. The toxin gleamed a strawberry milkshake color, a sign that it contained both heroin and blood. The vermin dug his fangs into the meeting point of my thumb and index finger. I flicked him in the face with my other hand. I didn't want him dead before I bit into his hairy spine like a snack cake. He released his teeth just as my left foot, accompanied by the vessel brimming with my eternal love, slid up my inner thigh. Slowly, I grabbed the syringe with my hand. The rat looked up at me with his dingleberry-sized eyes. He knew it was coming. He could see a cloud of death rolling into the decrepit assemblage taking place in the gymnasium that he called home. From the corner of my eye, I caught a peek of the yellow caution tape that guarded my birth secrets and the evidence that the cloth had committed crimes in the eyes of their god. It reminded me that, like it was for the rat, this was my home. Starving for a fix, I pulled back on the plunger and dragged my now wet tongue across my dehydrated and busted lips. The rat squirmed for a second, then he stopped, looked up at me, and gave up. From across the circle, I heard another familiar voice. It was the voice of my conscience again, only this time it had the tone of a 13-year-old runaway. and a wannabe prostitute. Balia Jenkins. Bait.
Make me like you?
And with the voice of my failure, I finally looked up.
Bite my neck, she pleaded with me. You can make me live forever. You're a vampire.
I dropped the rat and the skag, looking away from her. As the lights dimmed in the room and the horde of wrongdoers, the NA equivalent of the Legion of Doom, collected their kids, their hatchets, their fetus shooters, and slung bronzed baby shoes around their necks. I lifted my head again and saw the truth. My truth. In front of me was a sneering Des, lightly patting another me on the head as if I had just inched out a win at a spelling bee. I was the one who saved him from the streets when he was left at the dump by the fucking priests. And he repaid me by taking away the closest connection to humanity that I ever had. The cure for my loneliness and pain. In the arms of my duplicate, in my other mouth, and literally all over the other me, was what was left of Bait. I didn't know whether Des killed Bait out of jealousy, or if he, like almost all the creatures like us, was indifferent to the lives of humans. It didn't make sense to fully blame him for killing Bait. He may have tortured her and delivered the final blow, but I was just as much to blame for bringing her into my wreckage. If I could have bitten her neck and brought her back to life, I would have. The fact is, that was just romantic fiction. And no matter how many times I told her that I didn't have any miraculous powers beyond my super strength, fast healing, and sensitive hearing, she refused to believe me. For some reason, I stood up from my uncomfortable nightmare chair and walked across the circle to the welcoming arms of the traitor, Des. I bent down in front of him and the other me. Then, I shared in the feast of the 13-year-old girl who taught what it meant to feel alive. Chapter 2. Misplaced. The buzzing of a prepaid cell phone that Eldritch picked up from me at a 7-Eleven woke me. It vibrated against my face and dusted up some pebbles on the balmy Texas asphalt where I guess I had passed out. We had spent a few days on the run, hiding out in abandoned buildings around the outskirts of Austin, and it was enough to force anyone into an alley for a nap. You'd never know when you'd find something comforting, like a pissed-on throw pillow that lived a second life beyond the giveaway bin at the local Salvation Army. I scrapped some eye boogers off my lashes and yawned. Coming off half a week of Poor Man, Eldritch's fun-time concoction of Rottweiler blood, 80% meth, and 20% heroin, was an unmatched spiral to the bottom of the heap. That is, of course, when the buzzing paranoia and face-picking turns the corner to exhaustion. I looked at the phone display. Where are you? Are you still on 6th? You've been in that alley for over an hour. I'm not sure if I could see clearly enough to process all the exclamation and question marks at the end of his text. However, I was sure his intention was to convey a sense of urgency that he normally reserved for the editors who spew out his dick-suck-worthy acting reels and his crack team of antique furniture delivery men who couldn't seem to get that unique 18th century armoire to his 10 thou a month bat cave quickly enough. Trying to keep my two-ton eyelids open long enough to grab the handset with my post-amphetamine shake-fest jumping bean hands, I wrote back, "Fuck you. Taking a nap." I scratched at the crown of my head. I came up with a handful of dead hair rather than relief. The phone buzzed again. "Good God, man. Need I remind you that for every hourglass grain that passes, constables are running Amber Alerts on television?" The overuse of exclamation on the second text made me dizzy. I propped myself up from my fetal meth position and sucked in the hot, polluted air of Austin. I tried to shake my eyes straight, and the refuse in my hair loose. That was a mistake. Immediately I found my head between my bent legs. hurling up the single-serve bag of pepperoni pizza combos that I swiped from a gas station during my ill-fated journey through the streets of this white trash knockoff of Los Angeles. The only real difference between this asshole of a town and the cesspool of my formative years is hipster, indie, ball-licking music, taking center stage in front of the washed-up whores turned DJs that I had become accustomed to. Oh, and of course the fact that street people in Austin were lowered to wearing the second-hand fashion statements of 2 years ago that the Lost Angel pricks delivered as care packages to brighten the hopes of the excrement that filled the streets of South by Southwest. I had been so totally out of it since we left California, stopping only in Peoria, Arizona to take care of some business involving a child molester and his accepting wife, that I didn't really have time to pull myself through the pain of downtown Shitville. To Austin's credit, it was a lot like Silver Lake and Los Feliz. The same D-bags exchanged their cardigan sweaters for knit caps and ironic Donkey Kong wristbands. As if my confessional nightmare wasn't crummy enough, it was followed by waking up in the center of an aiming low star fucker nirvana. Playing to my predicament, I tried to get all the speedy, rancid bile out of my stomach. Luckily for me, the delicious pretzel outer shell of the combos provided my tongue with flavor and my throat with buffer. A hand tugged on my shoulder. Hey friend, you okay?" I picked out a piece of combo stuck between my teeth with my tongue and spit it onto his custom limited edition Adidas. That was when I noticed his shirt. It said, "Funky Cold Medina." "Really, dude?" I blurted out like a fortified wine-drenched vagrant. "Funky Cold Medina? That's the best you could do?" "Whatever, you piece of shit," he said, as he threw a handful of loose change in my face. The phone buzzed again, causing it to shake off my knee and onto the ground. I picked it up as my vision crossed planes between blurry and borderline dyslexia-like symptoms. Before I took the time to focus on the new message, I realized why Eldritch was quiet for a few moments. It wasn't because he wanted me to collect my thoughts or get my shit together. Rather, he wanted to produce a manifesto, detailing our situation in flowery Shakespearean dialect. I closed my left eye because it was agitated by the LED-lit display and held the phone in path with a streetlight, as if that made any sense or resulted in any difference whatsoever. It read, "No response. That is what could be expected from a shrewd individual of your character. As the sun creeps up on us, such as the plague of our fathers, you have simply forgotten the situation you have delivered onto us. My trusted carriage," I think he was talking about his retarded hearse, "is the suspected kidnappers and killers' transportation. If you cannot commandeer a more formidable mode of transportation, then I must no longer participate in your folly of misguided and dangerous actions. Simply stated, I will be leaving you to your own devices and dropping off the child at the nearest constable house. In an agreement we made, you promised full participation in helping to veil us from those who find us the despicable demons who took the lives of an innocent suburban couple and abducted their soul-living offspring. Am I correct to expect your aid? Please advise on your progress and respond with due diligence. Regretfully, if your complete participation in this matter is met with tomfoolery, then I am out of—" His fancy-pants words strung together as a blob of nonsense, but it was all too obvious that he was preoccupied with a kid to finish his text, to which I replied, "Don't end a sentence with a preposition. Bad English. 1, 2, 3. Just get the fucking car, RJ." I hadn't really seized the opportunity to laugh at myself in recent weeks, so I took a second, licked the barf off the back of my teeth, and giggled a little. I slid my drained body up a brick wall and typed, "On it." Eldritch was right about one thing. The night was coming to an end. As SXSW scenesters started stumbling out of their new favorite clubs where they discovered their new favorite bands, I inched along the sidewalks, being bounced around like a racquetball by drunken, coked-out corduroy. My path drove me further and further from the action. I needed to find a less conspicuous vehicle than the overwhelming lot of refurbished rockabilly posers' classic Ford pickup trucks and roadsters that lined the after-hours parking spots on 6th Street. Beyond that, I needed to find something more practical for two people essentially allergic to sunlight and a preteen girl who, unfortunately, needed to be tied up and gagged. Kind of a funny thing about me saving Bates' little sister Pinball from the atrocities of the double wide where she grew up is that she only understood what she saw. Acting on nothing but vengeance for her sister, I did not make a good first impression on her. As a matter of fact, our introduction was the ripping apart of her stepfather and mother. In other words, I was the monster who killed her loving parents and took her away from her life. You can never know how a child interprets abuse. Maybe my victims, Thomas the child rapist and his glutton of a wife, told her they did what they did out of love. It was either that, or she simply couldn't differentiate between having a middle-aged man's testicles in her mouth and getting a loving hug for doing well in school. So, if me being a monster in the eyes of a child for the time being meant that Pinball didn't end up as burnt pieces in the remains of a meth lab in the Salton Sea like her sister, then so be it. Despite my recommendation to leave her in Peoria, Eldritch insisted that we take her with us. I don't know why. The last thing that I wanted was another kid to worry about and take care of. My knees popped as I stopped at the window of an electronics store and took a good look at myself. "I don't think I know you," I said to my reflection. My bushy mess of a hairdo shot out sideways, overgrown at my ears. It was still kind of blonde, but all the blood and dirt that clumped onto it since I last showered at Eldritch's loft in Los Angeles just made it look like someone sprayed shit on my head every morning. Even worse, the hair acted as lights leading into a landing strip that drew all attention to the drooping and bagged craters that contained my eyes. The eyes were sometimes blue and sometimes green. Rarely did others get the opportunity to gaze into my peepers, my best quality, because my pupils were constantly dilated. So, if I ever had to describe myself to anyone, I would play it safe and say I had black and red eyes. The older I got, the more my cheekbones tended to push at the bags. It was a constant fight between what seemed to be living material and the death spreading across the center of my face. I dug around the edges of my nose with my index finger and my thumb. My large nostrils were so dry that the flaky skin created a path of irritation right into the top of my lips, which seemed to have a constant cut near the middle of the top. I curled my lip and threw my arms over my head, doing my best imitation of Billy Idol. I quietly wailed like Billy, but came up embarrassingly short. My rebel yell was more of a careless whisper. My bony arms dropped to my sides and I slapped on my atrophy-mutated belly. The drugs tore down our bodies, but combined with blood, they helped us live. The body was just a shell in a constant state of hyperkinetic rejuvenation. Unfortunately, my organs didn't self-build muscle, but they never stopped layering bandages on top of bandages. I bent over to a puddle by my feet, wiped the sewage across my face, and then stood up again to look at the piece of shit that stared back at me. The water was refreshing, but did little to mask my junky features. At that point in my life as a career degenerate, I could dip my face in paint and make cool Misfits t-shirts. I dragged my tongue across the roof of my mouth that was coated with yuck mouth plaque. I licked some scum water off my cheek and tried to swish it around. I guessed my breath was always shit. I stuck out my tongue. It was bumpy and blue, as if it was the first thing that a couple of wisecracking TV detectives noticed after I had been fished out of the wharf. It matched the color of various unseen parts of my body, like my armpits, or the raw area on the insides of my thighs around my balls. I slapped on my stomach a few times and then spit out the sludge I used as mouthwash. Then, I stretched my neck closer to the electronics store and smiled into the window. My teeth were fucked up, The naturally crooked, street-cultivated ivory struggled to stay attached to the root. The years of drugs had browned each of them around the gum line and cracked them around the rim and back. If I licked my teeth, I could feel the broken-down damage and poverty of being a gross addict. On top of that, I was a grinder when I slept. So, the irony of being a vampire with teeth that could barely break down a piece of steak was never lost on me. It was my reality, and it wasn't like I could swing by a dentist's office, even if I had the money or insurance to do so. I bobbed my head back and forth and lifted up my ratty t-shirt as I started dragging my hand up my torso. My fingers wobbled in and out of my ribs that stuck out in weird places. I did have the power to heal, but nothing ever grew back perfectly. Wherever there was a break at some point in my life, there were little balls that ranged in size from BBs to golf balls. Like I said, before my body was comprised of bandages layered over bandages. If something broke, it would tie itself off like a water balloon, or sprinkle a little glob of superglue under the fracture. My body never finished the job by sanding over protrusions, so jagged edges and bumps were common. I knew my body was torn up, but I had no noticeable scars. The only plus of being a vampire, or an aborto fiend, was the healing part. The sensitive hearing was kind of useless. The super strength was cool, but it wasn't like any of us used our powers for good. As a whole, at least judging from the things like me that I had met, we were pretty much a society of psychotic boobs. It had been a long time since I looked at myself, so I pulled my shirt over my head and inched even closer to the window to see if I could catch a glimpse at any remaining ink from my Faction Batman tattoo. It was eroded off of my chest by acid when I was kidnapped by those awesome Catholic priests that always seemed to guest star in my nightmares. No dots of ink or even a scar remained. I rubbed at the section where it used to be, over my heart, maybe hoping that some skin was covering it up. Stupid, really. According to Cobra, the cloth did me a favor by removing it from my body. At the very least, no more Batman or vampire bat jokes for the rest of my life. I certainly wasn't going to replace it. All that said, being semi-bulletproof didn't beat being covered in a bunch of scars. The scars on the inside hurt worse and didn't look as cool. I pulled my shirt back down and tried to pull myself out of my hypnosis by hopping up and down a few times. My actions caused my dick to jump in my saggy jeans. I didn't have a huge penis, but it was bigger than a lot of the dicks that I had ripped off of other dudes. I was so blessed. My soft dick was bigger than a bunch of guys who knew that they were about to be killed. Nothing gives a man a hard-on more than knowing that he is seconds away from not breathing. I rolled my eyes as I flicked the front of my jeans. What a useless apparatus. We couldn't get a fucking boner unless we shot ourselves up with Viagra and blood. Most of us couldn't have kids, as if we'd ever want that. And it still hurt to get punched in the balls. The cloth should have done us all a favor and just hacked our cocks off. It probably would have made us a more streamlined army of insects. I never got to ask Father McAteer why the cloth decided to circumcise us rather than going all in. It must have been the natural secondary process after they sterilized us and preparation process before discarding us in dumpsters. All that time studying my broken body in the electronic shop's window came to a halt when I noticed a news flash come on a TV in front of me. It was about this dude Eldritch was in love with, named Stephen Roderick. He was the star of a popular kiddie vampire movie series called The Nightshade Chronicles. As we heard days earlier, on our way to Peoria, he OD'd on heroin, but didn't die. Eldritch assured me that he was one of us, a vampire. I watched closely as they displayed his headshot on one side and showed clips from the melodramatic turds that little girls called cinema. My eyes shifted focus back to my reflection. If they only knew what vampires really looked like. I doubted that he was one of us. His teeth, his eyes, his cheekbones, his hair, and his body were all too perfect. As I fixated on his perfection, anger grew inside of me. If he was a ghoul like me, why the fuck did he have it so good? A flash of light bounced off the window, blinding me. "What the fuck?" I yelled as I covered my eyes. I spun away from the window to see a blurred figure taking a picture of me with his phone. It was my funky cold Medina friend from the alley. "Hey, asshole," I said. "Why are you following me?" He didn't respond. Rather, he touched the screen on his phone, threw it into his backpack, and started running. I hobbled along after him, calling out, "Are you with the cloth? Who the fuck are you? Why are you taking pictures of me?" "Follow him. He has heroin." Damn it. The gooch again. It had started while Cobra and me were imprisoned by Fat Mac and the cloth. They had used methadone to curb my heroin cravings. It was the voice that whispered in my ear, tugged on my arms, and ripped at my scalp, which never invaded my heinous dreams. It just came out when I was feeling alone, feeling hungry. So, in addition to finding a replacement car so we could ditch Eldritch's hearse, my other mission was to find heroin. The simple truth was, Skag shut the gooch up, and I didn't like being reminded what a stain on the world I had been since I was brought to life. So, I followed the Medina guy, because I wanted to be alone, in my head. Chapter 3. Silenced. I tried to track the Medina dude as I scraped my toes against the concrete, making it further from the dimming lights of Last Call in downtown Austin. I knew that the closer I got into the world of scrap heaps, pawn shops, and tow yards, the closer I got to securing a less conspicuous vehicle. In Eldritch's defense, he didn't know that following me into the war to save bait would result in us making our way to Austin. However, I couldn't excuse him from spinning around in a hearse with a chrome platinum motorsports customization emblem on the gate, emphasized by a license plate that read NSFRATU. The lengths that guy went to were painful. They might as well have run over a reporter covering the death of Bait and Pinball's gross parents in a Wonder Bread truck and whipped out our dicks for the cameraman. But hey, it's all in hindsight, right? When I originally went to save Bait, I had no idea I would end up in Peoria and then Austin either. He said he had a plan, and he saved my ass several times. It was dumb to kidnap the kid, but I owed him. The streets got darker as the businesses became sparser and more beaten down. Medina had long since disappeared behind the shadows of the buildings in front of me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I shook my head, pulled it out, and turned it on. "Please tell me you found a vehicle, RJ." And just like that, I had forgotten about the dumbass Medina taking a picture of me altogether. I looked up from the phone without responding, and, as luck would have it, in the economic urinal of Austin, I saw a car lot. Well, it wasn't exactly a car lot per se. It was more of an animal shelter. At the moment, though, it seemed to provide the perfect solution to my dilemma. I could steal a dog catcher truck. Eldritch and I could roll in the front, and we could put the kid in the cage in the back. The police would never suspect a dog catcher mobile in Austin to answer for the murders of two scumbags in Peoria. I shook off the spins and looked up the chain-link security fence until my eyes reached the razor wire that rolled ominously across the top. Although I didn't quite understand why such security measures were in place for a building that housed manged infected pets that nobody wanted, except for some hippie giving their dumb kid a first taste of responsibility, I figured scaling it would be a piece of cake. I cracked my knuckles and then my neck. I blinked really fast 20 times, wiped a little bit of spit off the corner of my mouth, and then jogged in a circle. Ah, the art of procrastination in an area of life that I had mastered. It wasn't so much that I felt I couldn't tackle a 10-foot barrier as much as I was pretty burned out. Compound that with the fact that I was desperately in need of blood and heroin, and you have a formula for defeat. That's right, friend. You need heroin. I managed to creep up the shaky fence with relative ease. That was, until I reached the razor wire. Remaining as steady as I could, I propped my legs up to the highest point and extended my body upright. This maneuver allowed me to shift my left leg over the death trap as I supported my weight by grabbing onto 2 razorless strands of wire. It would have been nice if I had had clippers. Wait a minute, I said to myself. Why was I bothering to climb the fence at all? It would have been much easier to simply open an entrance for myself at the bottom. After all, I did have super strength. Ugh, I was being such a dipshit. As I pulled back my leg and prepared to hop down and start over with Plan B, a bright light flared on behind me. Fuck! I lost balance and nearly swallowed my tongue. I fell backwards and upside down, tangling my legs in the razor wire. A little bit of piss squirted out of me and a sharp pain bit into my ankles. Damn it! I figured the cops had me. I slowly peeked out of one eye into the glare, expecting to see a patrol car's spotlight blazing on my face. There were no cops standing in front of me with guns drawn, however. The light came from the marquee of a run-down cinema across the street. I hadn't noticed it when I was jogging in circles like a fucking idiot. I kind of wished I had. Before I sat up to entangle myself, I tilted my head sideways to read what was playing. I figured it was probably some late-night rubby theater for perverts who didn't believe in home video. Chaplains, the marquee read. Well, it was supposed to be chaplains, but for some reason the N was hung backwards. I didn't know if it was a piss-poor attempt to be alternative or subversive, or if the pock-faced usher who hung it was just stupid. I decided that my first assumption was correct. The great lengths that the Austinites went to being perceived as counterculture was exhausting. Funky, cold Medina, I said, remembering the dumb hipster who threw change at me. What an asshole. The double doors of the building flung open. From the blackness inside, a figure appeared, spinning a cane. Under a black bowler hat waddled a man with a white face, Hitler mustache, and dirty crumpled suit. As he reached the front of the theater, the humming neon of the marquee illuminated and blinked so I could see his full getup. The cane stopped spinning as if it was controlling him like the winding key of a toy robot. He stopped right before he reached the curb and stared at me. Still inverted, I grinned out of the side of my mouth and pointed at my legs. I really wanted a dog. I gave an uneasy laugh, unsure where this encounter was headed. Right? The man didn't respond. He blinked a few times and he bent down. The bowler hat toppled from his head and landed in his palm as he took a bow. That was a good sign. I mean, it was queer as hell, but it was much better than half of Austin's cops surrounding me at gunpoint. He rolled the hat up his arm and back onto his dark, greased-back hair. He continued to gaze at me. After a minute of us uncomfortably making eye contact, I attempted to bend my body upward and unlock my legs. Unsuccessful, I dropped back down. 2 other figures appeared on both sides of the Charlie Chaplin impersonator. On his left side, a thick-bodied chic guy in a turban with his arms crossed. He nodded. On the right was another guy in a bow tie and a gray striped jacket. He tried to pull a pork pie hat onto his head, and it popped up into the air above him. Frustrated, he pulled it down again to the same result. All 3 of them, their faces painted with bright foundation, thick eyeliner, and black lipstick, remained dead silent. So, are you guys in a ska band or something? The silence continued. They didn't even smirk at my attempt to lighten the mood. The marquee caught my eye again. Chaplains. I slapped myself on the forehead. Oh, I get it. You guys are supposed to be Buster Keaton and Rudolph Valentino. Surprisingly, I knew a lot about pre-talkie movies from living with that washed-up kitty star-turned-junkie nun, The Habit. At the time, she was trying to get her career on track by playing Mary Pickford in a Lifetime movie. They laughed her out of the building during her first audition. She may have brought a bunch of heroin home for both of us, but in hindsight, I should have killed her when I had the chance. You boys playing dress-up tonight? I joked. And yet, they still didn't respond. I nodded and looked up at the sparse blood in my body running down my legs. Defeated, I looked back at my new friends. Their numbers had doubled. Some fat fuck in a bigger bowler, kerchief, and thick bacon-sized suspenders that reluctantly held up his enormous pleated pants appeared behind the sheik. Another sharply dressed guy with a top hat and a cane tucked under his arm was joined by some woman with greasy-ass hair, who I guessed was supposed to be Garbo. That is, if Garbo had a meth face. I scratched at my thigh and covered my hand with blood. "Okay, I'm sorry," I pleaded. "I shouldn't be breaking in here. Can you give me a pass this time and help me down? I'm gonna bleed the fuck out." I brought my hand to my mouth and licked it, trying to refuel my body with whatever I could. Still, no response. I exhaled, deciding that these clowns were going to sit there and watch me die. What a way to go. Fucking idiot. And just when I decided things couldn't get any worse, the centerpiece, the tramp, flipped his cane and held it straight across his chest. Spikes popped out of Chaplin's cane, and the rest followed suit by arming themselves with various weapons. Fatty Arbuckle bounced a bat off his foot as Valentino unsheathed a half-moon sword from behind his back. Speed-scarred Garbo snatched 2 blades from her garters. Another new member in a Sherlock Holmes getup, either John Barrymore or Basil Rathbone, lit a match and fired up a deep, bucketed pipe. I tugged my legs with my pelvis, trying desperately to somehow shake myself free. The razors dug into my shins, scraping into the bones with their points. My body started to grow a little cold. I bounced my back against the fence and almost said, "Come on, guys, this isn't funny anymore." But it was never funny, and I would have sounded like a pussy. And then, as the neon of the marquee popped and blinked, the now 10-person 1920s horror show started walking toward me. Chaplin led the way, twirling his death cane. Oh, fuck me. Knowing if I didn't get free that I'd become a living piñata, I reached up and began tearing apart the razor wire that was crippling me. I was becoming increasingly dizzy as I started grabbing furiously onto wire wherever I could snap it free. The blades thrashed my hands. I looked at the cast of terror. They had made it halfway across the street. They closed in on me in a tight half-circle, with Tramp moving to the back center. My left leg finally broke free. Knowing time was not on my side, I tugged the right leg free, tearing some wire down with me. I managed to shift my body and bend my head to the side so I could land on my shoulder instead of my head. I pushed myself up quick and faced them. "Okay, you fucking weirdos." I wiped my hand up my body, trying to capture as much blood as I could. I drenched my face. The time for talking's over. I jumped toward them as they took to defensive positions, raising their weapons. "You guys do not want to fuck with me!" I swung the razor wire like a whip, and they folded back a bit to avoid contact with the spikes. There wasn't enough slack from where the rest of the wire still connected to the fence, though, and my only weapon was pulled back from my hand and clattered to the ground. Oh, fuck it. I put my fists up and stupidly jumped into the center of the posse, swinging away. From my right eye, I saw Fatty lift his baseball bat to swing at my face. I caught the end in my palm and tugged it free from his grip. I flipped it over to my other hand and plunged it into heinous Greta Garbo's nose. She didn't scream or cry. Rather, she went cross-eyed. As she dropped to her back, she latched onto my belt loops and slid under me, cutting into my heels with her daggers. As I ducked down and jumped backward to avoid the rapier of Douglas Fairbanks, I managed to catch Garbo by her snatch. Disgusting wharf-like fumes materialized in my nostrils. Her eyes shot wide open as the smell made me vomit on her, then pounded my heel into her throat, snapping all the bones like a box of crayons. Trying to hold my breath so I wouldn't get sick again from the smell of her lady juice, I set my thumb on her clitoris and shoved my 4 free fingers into her hole. Before she had the opportunity to fight me off, I held down her thighs with my other foot and tore her plumbing from pelvis up to her gullet and all the way through to her heart, plowing through her organs and opening her up like a body bag. I smashed a hodgepodge of her insides into my mouth and used my tongue to squeeze the nectar like a sponge. Vampire blood. There were vamps in Texas? There were girl vamps in Texas? With my strength returning, I nabbed the bat off the ground and swung it savagely, completely knocking Fairbanks' head off his neck. The body stood for a second, then went limp, falling on top of Garbo. Without taking any time to assess my situation, I jumped on Arbuckle as Valentino started to make his move with the Sinbad sword. I dug into Fatty's jugular and ripped it free from his sweaty, clammy flesh. To avoid Valentino's sword, I spun Lardass around by his neck, using him as a shield in front of me. The blade split his head down the middle of his skull as he gasped for air. I shoved his jugular vein into my mouth and leapfrogged over his shoulder, trapping Valentino's arm between my thighs. I clamped his forearm tight, and as he released the handle of the sword, I spun around and broke the arm in half. I kicked him down and hammered the bat repeatedly into his clavicle and sternum. Trying to remain focused on the movement around me, I clawed his chest open and had at whatever organs I could get my hands on. It was about the moment when I swallowed Fatty's jugular vein and shoved Valentino's liver into my mouth that I realized these motherfuckers were on some pretty heavy drugs. That's not heroin. I didn't know which drugs they were, however, because an unfamiliar tingling throbbed in my head, causing me to become disoriented. Seconds were dropping from my vision, and everything around me became choppy. The world seemed to melt as I tried to shake off the feeling. The marquee blared into my eyes and zoomed in and out, becoming more and more faded and losing focus. Everything went hyperactive. Before I had the opportunity to take a breath, piano wire snapped about my neck. I whirled around to find myself only millimeters from Sherlock's pipe. The synthetically laced tobacco smoke blinded my already fogged eyes. I palmed the pipe into his mouth and, catching him off guard, I bent down under the now loosened piano wire and headbutted him in the chest. As he doubled over, I knocked over his deerstalker hat, seized the back of his head, and pounded him face first into the pile of rocks. His arm shot out cartoony and started flapping around like a breezy geezer at a car dealership. I planted my knee into the back of his head, flattening his face into the concrete. I shifted all my weight into my knee until I crushed his cranium, exposing his brain. I huddled over him and dug my teeth into the hole. I could have sworn his brain was talking to me. Maybe the gooch had made a telepathic connection. Pleased with my meal, I looked up to see the lesser-known stars retreat into the theater. Chaplin, however, swung his cane around and pointed it at me. His face stretched horizontally, opening holes in it that flickered like film grain. I was having massive hallucinations. The marquee shined from behind him and lit up his black outfit. He looked like Hitler combined with Christ. I stood up, brushed myself off, and walked toward him. He stood his ground, and then, in a moment of breaking character, he ran at me with the cane in front of him. Clicking another button as he closed in, he released a massive switchblade at the cane's tip. Distracted by the terrifying hallucinations unfolding everywhere around me, I fell backward. Before I realized it, Chaplin was on top of me. I turned sideways, catching the blade in my right arm. I looked at my arm. It looked like my foot. He shoved his hand in my face. It also looked like a foot. He secured the dominant position on top of me, and for some reason, he started slapping me in the face. Realizing that wasn't damaging anything other than my pride, he tried to gouge my eyes out. My body was so jumpy and wired that he couldn't hit either target. I slipped my arms under his knees, breaking off the blade from the cane, which was now deeply lodged in my bicep. I latched onto his trunk and pulled him close. The white makeup on his face smeared into his black hair, his eyeliner cascaded down his cheeks like tears. I locked my arms together around his back. He sucked in, trying to gain the air coming from his mouth. That's when I sat up, snapping him inversely over himself. He hacked out some blood and bent back onto his legs like a folding chair. I don't know if I was afraid that he was going to crawl away, but before I got back up, I pulled my arms out from under him and wrenched his head off. His shirt buttons popped open, and much to my surprise, it said, Funky Cold Medina. Why were you taking pictures of me? I stared into the horror of his dead eyes for a second, expecting him to say something. He didn't. So, with my fingers, I moved his lips and started singing. So I gave some to my dog when he began to beg. Then he licked his bowl and he looked at me and did the wild thing on my leg. I tossed the head aside because I became preoccupied with my hideously deformed hoof hands. I started picking a hole into my hoof hands. Ha! Funky Cold Medina. What a fucking awesome shirt. My body pulsated as the marquee went dark. You're wet, the gooch said. And he was right. The chaplains were filled with the strongest PCP I had ever taken. Chapter 4. Poisoned. It took me a while, but I was almost back to the abandoned barn and fire pit where I'd left Eldritch and Pinball. As soon as I saw their silhouettes bouncing off the fire, I gunned the dog catcher truck. If I timed everything right, I figured the truck would drift to a halt directly in front of them. Then, I'd kick open the door for them to get in. Of course, piling in would take them time, since the shock and awe of my stuntman-inspired entrance would leave them dead fucking silent for a bit. And they would, of course, have to shake off the dust that I sprayed all over their faces first. The way I envisioned it, now, mind you, I was on enough PCP to make the entire 70s student population throw themselves from high school roof. When I kicked open the passenger door, I would hear a sad trombone sound effect, as if God were supplying the score and Foley work for my every living move. I would tip my black felt cowboy hat up, if I were wearing a hat. Covered from head to toe in the desert's salt of the earth, foolish Eldritch would open his eyes and then throw his Texas sheriff's hat on the ground and stomp on it. Deputy Pinball's eyes would suddenly appear behind a mask of dirt. She would remain still for a couple seconds, and then begin shaking. Boom! Tears would burst from her face. Then, at the very end of my dazzling automotive ballet, after they realized that I had gotten the best of them, I would wink. Fuck! I wish I had that hat. I decided that the hat wasn't as important as a toothpick. I needed a toothpick. Wink and toothpick. The toothpick would surely go down as the icing on my cool cake. So, yeah, it didn't quite go down like that. I gunned the truck. At the same time, I started flicking my high beams and honking the horn. It was then that I noticed that the steering wheel looked less like a steering wheel and more like a donut. I finally looked up at Eldritch. As expected, his eyes bugged from his dumb face like a wolf in a Tex Avery cartoon. Well, maybe not. I don't know. He nabbed Pinball by her collar, popped her under his arm, and started running from the fire pit. I quickly recalibrated my mission as Eldritch leapt like a bitch off a billy goat and headed toward the abandoned barn in the distance. I told him hours earlier that we could take refuge in the barn, but he wouldn't listen to me. He insisted that it gets cold in the desert at night and that we would need to build a fire. He argued in way too many words that the years of sun in the old wood was a certain fire trap for loose embers jumping from a campfire. I tried to roll down my window, but my broken wrist prevented me from success. So, I just used that hand and mashed it through the window. "That's right, ass fuckers! Barn's good enough for you now!" I screamed. Yeehaw! My margin of opportunity was closing. Seconds before he reached the entrance to the barn, I decided it was time to spin the custom steering wheel, which my warped brain still saw as a cruller, and perform the money shot. My heart raced in my ear as I ground my teeth in anticipation. I spun away. Spin wheel, spin! The race car drift sequence began as planned, but I overcompensated for the turn and whirled the wheel off the console with my super vampire strength. "Oh, shit!" I cracked in my best southern twang. Actually, it was more of a southern drawl, I think. The dog catcher truck oscillated about 180 degrees before it began rolling. About 3.5 revolutions later, the truck came to a stop on its side. Some obnoxious alert sound buzzed in my ears as if the door was ajar in my brain, signaling that I was in imminent danger. There was still a 50-50 chance that when I untangled myself from the truck, Eldritch and Pinball would be covered head to toe in dust, and that the only real casualty would be the truck that had taken me around 6 to 7 hours to commandeer. I unfastened my seatbelt and lifted myself through the passenger side window above. "Please don't go off," I begged the airbag. I coughed a bit and counted to 5 to make sure that all the pieces were in play for the big reveal. I decided that I would end the scene with an incredibly astute statement like, "Need a ride? You might want to clean yourselves up first." I fully lifted myself from the truck and turned to face them, but it was too dark outside, and since they were no longer in front of the fire, I had a difficult time making out whether or not they were blanketed in dust. I adjusted my sight. They didn't move. I cleared my throat. They remained still. I waited another second or two. It might have been a minute or two. I couldn't really gauge time lapsing because the entire world was spinning and dissolving around me still from the PCP. I cleared my throat yet again. Eldritch took a step toward me. Pinball hid behind his leg. He cranked his head to the side as if he was disoriented. A good sign he'd been sandblasted. I rubbed off some blood from my right ear and ate it. You, guys need a ride?" I winked, but they stood silent. I jumped to the ground and lifted my hands over my head briefly to suck in more air. Their lack of expression was killing me. I breathed too hard, though, vomiting bile all over myself. I doubled over from the smell and was reminded that not only was I not wearing pants, but I had shit all over myself in the truck. I wiped my forearm on my ass cheek to make sure I remembered the soiling correctly. I had. Amazingly, I caught Pinball's eyes as she peered out behind Eldritch's legs. She was crying. Unfortunately, it wasn't the type of crying that I was expecting. In my mind, her crying was expected to be akin to a conquered grown man. I was fully expecting something along the lines of Junior and Smokey and the Bandit. Nope. Her crying was the result of witnessing absolute horror, then feeling absolute terror. I looked down at my body. My left arm was dangling. My chest was caved in so badly that I could see a crater in my sternum. Both of my legs were completely shredded from the razor wire that surrounded the animal control lot. I bent down and tore off the passenger side mirror and took a closer look. Blood was gushing out from every open hole in my face. I looked worse than most of the Chaplin victims back at their theater. Eldritch let Pinball go from the protection of his leg. She darted forward, then veered off toward the barn. He remained quiet and lowered his head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that he was more disappointed than terrified by everything that had gone down. He wasn't ever easy to scare, but his inability to say anything spoke volumes. Pinball unlatched the decaying barn door and slipped inside. Nausea washed over me and I collapsed under my own weight. I puked again. I guess I was actually poisoned by all the PCP in my system. When I finally managed to get to a relatively stable stance, I began to shuffle and drag myself toward the barn. "RJ, no!" Eldritch shouted. I got close enough to him to realize that he wasn't covered in dust or sand or anything dirty whatsoever. "Let me handle this, please," I said. I grabbed onto the door latch, closed one eye in an attempt to focus and stretch myself back to full height. My bones, which were only partially broken, cracked and shattered inside my stumbling carcass. My body was drowning in its blood, which was pushing me into shock. Unluckily for me, the power of a lethal dose of amphetamines inside my body was like dumping recycled water over my head, waking me up. I heard Pinball whimpering under Eldritch's hearse. He'd parked it in the barn because, even though we were nowhere near the street, someone in Peoria likely spotted it, and cops were on the lookout. It's not a stretch to say that you could see it from the moon. I lugged myself closer to her. "It's okay. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. It's just me. RJ. Remember?" I went on. "It's me, the friendly vampire guy." My right kneecap cracked and I dropped down to one leg. I could hear her, but with my senses booming different signals from all directions, it felt like the compass in my head was gyrating all over the place. Add the pulsating visuals of the PCP, and I might as well have been Snow White in a wheelchair, trying to escape an evil batch of forest creatures out for revenge. I heard a scuttle to my right, and my head snapped toward it.
"It's okay! I'm the good guy! Who saved you?"
Scurrying out from under the hearse, she plowed past me. As quick as I could, I reached back behind me to catch her, only to rip out a strand of her hair. I fell into my back and smacked my head on the corroded bumper of the dead car as her entire head of hair flew into my face.
"Jesus!"
I screamed, thinking I'd ripped her entire head off her body. Stunned, I threw the hairball on the hay on the ground, trying to shake it off me like a spider. It certainly didn't feel heavy enough to contain a head. With my eyes squinted, I picked it back up and surveyed it. I turned it over, hoping not to see Pinball's mangled scalp inside. Instead, I saw a tag. A tag from a wig. Completely perplexed, I looked over to see the dome of Pinball's bald head behind Eldritch's legs. As he petted her hairless head behind him, he breathed, "She has leukemia." And then, everything went black, including my ugly soul. Chapter 5. Blackened. I rubbed my forehead. It was drenched. How long have I been out? Eldritch handed me a rag to wipe my head. You've only been conscious for about... He looked at the face of his phone. 2 hours. Now, however, I am the one who is exhausted. 2 hours. I threw the rag back at him. That's nothing. He looked up from the hay beneath his legs. He was sitting Indian style on the floor of the barn. You have been out for 2 hours. He snapped a small twig between his fingers. I have been subduing you for 2 long days and nights. What do you mean? He picked up the rag again, folded it, and delicately placed it in my lap. I mean, you had ingested such an elevated level of angel dust, among other things, that you needed to be restrained throughout much of your 2-day flight through the world of insanity. He pointed at the rag and then dragged his finger across his right eye. What, in the name of Odin, happened to you? I took his signal and wiped my left eye, tucking the Odin comment into the back of what remained of my pulverized brain for use at a later time. Let's see. My body felt undone and bent like I imagined it would after freaking the fuck out for 2 days after fighting a gang of vampires and getting in a horrible self-inflicted car accident. The more I tried to remember what happened, the more I felt the stinging of a migraine. Well, I remember texting you when my heart finally stopped trying to escape from my chest as I was coming down off the poor man shit you fed me. Then I almost beat the dick off this stupid hipster cunt wearing a funky cold Medina shirt. He was taking pictures of me, so I followed him. I threw the rag back to him again. Eldritch cleared his throat and grabbed me by the chin with his palm. He stretched one of his metal talon fingers up to my forehead, and with the rag, he wiped my face. Please don't ever sing that melody again. Nothing beyond that chorus has blown from your lips for the past 2 days. I believe Paulina... He stopped rubbing my face. Paulina? The female youth? The one you call Pinball? Paulina? I propped myself up onto my elbows and looked around the barn. Where is she? Not to worry. She's outside by the fire. I barred her from any further exposure to this madness. Eldritch yanked a cigarette out of his pouch and cut a small slit in his tongue with his metal finger. A small bubble of blood gurgled on top. He licked the end of his cigarette and snapped his fingers to produce fire as theatrically as always. He lit it and sucked down a huge barrel of smoke that he then blew toward me. I felt the thick sting of cloves invade every unhealed scrape on my face. The sores tensed up and rejected the hideous exhaust. I would never forget that atrociously sweet smell multiplying and potentially further damaging my lifeless body. I rolled my head back to try and avoid it. Come on, you
Dick, if you're going to smoke those pussy goth cigarettes, please don't blow the smoke in my face. He ashed the cig. Cloves are a natural antioxidant. I lofted the smoke back at him. Not when you smoke them. Aren't they used to get rid of moths? He blew another drag in my face. I think you're confusing them with mothballs. I believe the smoke will accelerate your healing process. I have never seen anyone that forspelin. I spit out a big chunk of flesh that was hanging from my gums. Forspelin? I believe you would call it wasted? Whatever, Eldritch, like you've never been fucking wasted. He gripped my chin again, tighter this time, and dragged the talon from my forehead to directly above my left eye. There is no whatever. What happened next? I saw the campfire outside the barn reflecting through the holes in the rotted wood. Let's see. I made my way out of downtown Austin. The migraine continued to bite at my head. And then I found us a car. The truck. The tip of his metal blade dug into my eyebrow. That would be the constable truck for Animal Authority? I took him by the wrist and slowly pulled his fingers away from my face. I think it's called a dog catcher truck, but yeah, I figured we'd tie Pinball up and throw her in one of the cages or something. The lass's name is Paulina Jenkins. His unsteady hand began to shake and move back toward my face. God damn it, Eldritch, I think there's a fucking hole in my face, asshole. It isn't a blood smear or fucking chocolate. His talons folded into his lap like a peacock fanning its feathers as he calmly said, The hole in your face rejuvenated 2 days ago. However, you may continue your story. Thank you. So, I was climbing this fence to get into the dog pound, and I was completely fucked up. Lack of blood, still tweaking my brain out. Well, I managed to get my legs tangled up in this gnarly razor wire. Then I got jumped by a gang. A fucking vampire gang, dude. Did you know there were vamps here? Did you know there were girl vamps? Which gang? Are you kidding me? Is there more than one? How the hell did they know I was one of them? I'm sure they wouldn't have brought out their full arsenal of silent movie shitbags if they thought I was some drunk dildo who stumbled away from South by Southwest. I followed that guy who was taking pictures of me there. He was the leader of the gang. Blood started to dribble from the hole in my cheek. He nodded. They call themselves the Chaplains. Just so you are aware, there are many more supernatural beings in Austin than in Los Angeles. What? You're killing me here. Answer the question. How did they know I was a vamp? Why was he taking pictures of me? I swabbed at the hole like my finger was a Q-tip. Eldritch swatted my hand away. They must have put the Amber Alert and our arrival together. Then he shoved the rag back into the hole. The rag is clean. I held the rag on my cheek. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Eldritch nodded his head, approving that I finally decided to use the rag. Did you speak with anyone while within Austin city limits? He smirked. I bet you're real proud of yourself with that one, huh, Dick? I told you I spoke to that fucker in the funky cold Medina shirt. About 15 minutes later, he was behind me taking pictures of me. Then I followed him. Then I was attacked. I didn't know he was a vampire. He raised an eyebrow. Didn't you? His voice electrified my headache. I don't know, shithead, no! Are you sure you didn't know? I threw the rag back at him. Jesus fucking Christ, I thought he was some pervert! He looked down at the now disgusting ruby towel in his lap and whispered, The one thing that I do know is that the Chaplains only dress theatrically for combat. I was very good friends with them. Unfortunate. Maybe this funky cold median you spoke of is a new recruit. You once told me that you can smell other inhumans. I believe I can as well. It would not be outside the realm of possibility. The only thing I smell right now is your patchouli, and it's making me want to barf. He ignored the comment. Could you smell them? I ran my nose across my arm. I smelled like vomit and combos. Now I smell like vomit, combos, and BO meets diarrhea casserole. Do you think you could have hosed me the fuck down while I was losing my mind for 2 days? Alas, we are in the moistureless desert, RJ. I felt the drip start again. I snatched the rag out of his lap. So, yeah, maybe I followed this guy back there unconsciously because I suspected that he was a vampire. It doesn't matter. Even if he led me back there to his dress-up buddies in makeup and suits, I still smeared those assholes all over the pavement. I was like a super fighter. I was like an evil superhero cage fighter. Or something. I would have told Eldritch that the gooch instructed me to follow the guy, but that would have opened up another can of worms, and I didn't feel like breaking that seal. If he learned of me hearing voices that drove me to heroin, more than likely it would lead him to trying to exorcise it out of me using some Wiccan ceremony. Eldritch brushed a piece of hay off of his mesh tank top. Judging from your condition over the past 2 days, I am going to speculate that you are delusional. Scratch that. Either you are delusional now, or you were hallucinating heavily when you faced these veiled foes. Oh, for God's sake. Don't you mean Odin's sake? The corners of my mouth curled up, revealing my teeth. Before I got the chance to laugh, the flat end of his hand collided with my face. I should have let you perish. What kind of a man are you to consider putting a child in a cage? A child who recently witnessed the slaying of her parents at your hands. A child recovering from a malignant form of cancer. I polished the bridge of my nose as I shoved his hand away from me. What do you mean, cancer? I then remembered the unpleasantness of the barn and the wig. Oh. Yes, RJ. The child is recovering from leukemia. I never claimed to know anything about regular people diseases, and even though these sicknesses never really affected my kind, I do know the words cancer and AIDS equate to bad and death. How bad is it? I asked. Children's leukemia is never a good thing. However, to answer your boorish question, she has been in remission for over a year. It seems she's much stronger than she looks, from what she shared with me. Her parents shaved her head purposely to garner attention from their community. You're kidding, right? I am not. He rubbed his finger across his leg. I find her inability to comprehend the magnitude of her ailment concerning. Meaning? She understands that her hair fell out from the medication and treatment, and she partially understands that she is sick. I do not, however, believe she understands the disease or what could happen if she neglects it. I am suspicious that her guardians failed to explain it to her, and I am sure that she understood very little of what the doctors explained to her. He rubbed my face jizz off his palm. It is our duty to escort her somewhere free from danger. That somewhere will be without you. Why? Why just me? You're twice as dangerous as I've ever been. He proudly swung his black hair out of his face. Thank you. It's not a compliment, you vagina. We saved her from them. Those filthy fuckers raped her. We saved her from people who think it's okay to rape children with cancer. I seriously cannot, in my wildest dreams, think of anything worse than that. He opened his mouth to fire back, then closed it and huffed from his nose. Do you know why Bate called her Pinball, Eldritch? He shook his head. They called her Pinball because that pedophile of a stepfather of hers made a game out of pinning her down and making her lick his nuts while her mother watched and laughed. She's terrified of you, RJ. I clasped my hands together, the cliché for begging. Please let me speak with her. I need to make her understand. I did it because I promised her sister that I would. But you slew her parents and seized her as if she was your property. Step back, asshole, I grunted. You're the one who said we should take her. I wanted to leave her there. He shook his finger at me. We could not leave her there. I don't know if I agree with you or not, but I didn't take her. That was all you, Eldritch.
As far as she believes, you killed her siblings as well. Shall I also remind you that you attempted to devastate us in a truck while screaming nonsense and drenched in blood? You took off your breeches, and your frame was scantily held together by strings. Was it possible that, unlike her sister, Pinball was afraid of me? Was she afraid of vampires or whatever undead abortion we were? I needed to make this right. If not solely for me and my conscience and my haunting dreams, then I had to make it right for Bait. Okay, Eldritch, I finally agreed. What do you propose? The most difficult part will be you speaking to her and attempting to make her understand why we removed her from her home. Sounds easy enough, I said, remembering my long talks with Bait. As far as I knew, I was great with kids. It will not be. She is not her sibling. She is not the hardened soul you kept so close to your side. Whether or not we believe maiming her parents for the injustices they committed was honorable, they are all she has ever known. Her father having carnal knowledge of her and the reality of her declining health are two things she only understands in part because that is all there ever was for her. From what I have pieced together, she understood fornication with her father as a gift of love, and the disease as her punishment for her not loving him back enough. Eldritch's voice was sorrowful, and his eyes twitched. For some reason, he related to the girl. She was a familiar pain to him. Oh, it's okay, man. I put up my hands to relax him. You and I, we can make this okay. What do we need to do? He wiped a tear off his left cheek. Sadly, I believe that we have come to the end of our passage. We must release the child. I scratched the tip of my nose. Turning Pinball over to the cops made me feel like I was having an allergic reaction. Here's maybe a better idea. Who do you know in Austin? I worked with Stephen Roderick in the second Nightshade Chronicles film, he bragged. That's lame. Come on, starfucker, someone who isn't that guy. He hammered his fist into his palm. He is one of us, RJ. I told you when we escaped from Los Angeles. He is a very trustworthy and beautiful soul. Didn't we also hear that he just OD'd on heroin? I shot back. Think of someone else. He did OD and is recovering, which makes this a beneficial situation. He got up, locked the barn door, and flicked his cigarette outside. He will be looked at as a hero during his darkest hour, and we will safely be able to liberate the child. I ran my fingers through my hair, or at least tried to. It was hard to plow through due to all the gunk in it. Fine. How do we get in touch with this Nightshade bitch boy? Eldritch picked his phone out of his back pocket and walked back toward me. Sweet, I thought to myself. This was going to be as easy as ringing him up and dropping the kid off at the pool. Then he showed me the screen. Apparently, Eldritch called him several times the past few days, including when we were in Arizona. I grabbed the phone. Amateur, Eldritch. Did you leave a message? Several. And you don't think that was the reason I was attacked by those Chaplin guys? Eldritch raised his finger. He's an actor. A performer. I threw the phone at him. And if you're right, he's a fucking vampire, which means he really is a drug addict. And what follows drugs and vampires? Gangs, you shithead. What are we going to do? We need to go into the city and retrieve some medication for Paulina. There is an emergency letter in her purse. She's been complaining a lot. It might not be anything serious, but we will need to embezzle it from the appropriate apothecary. We just need the medicine to control her recovery and prevent her recovery from derailing. We will speak with some of the local organizations. I interrupted and stood up. Gangs. Gangs. He pounded his fist in his palm again. They will escort us to Roderick. Why bother? Why can't we just go get an Austin star map and go to his house? He's your boy. I do not believe there are star maps in Austin. He looked at his phone and began typing. I pushed his hand away. He's an actor? Yes, an excellent artist, and I grabbed him by the wrist. And? And he's the biggest narcotics dealer in the southwest of these American states. If your friend King Cobra were 3 people, they would not control as much as Roderick does. That can't be true. I released his arm. He's a dumb actor, just like you said. He makes shitty vampire lovey-dovey crap movies. He looked back at his phone and swiped down. He controls more than you could possibly comprehend. I can comprehend quite a lot. I swatted the side of his head. And this is your plan to save the girl. Hand her over to another crummy gang leader. You asked me if I knew anyone in Austin and if I had an alternative plan, good sir. You need something positive to divert the press away from the overdose. The only other choice is to turn ourselves over to the authorities. Let me talk to Pinball and see what she wants. There's no way I'm just going to hand her over to this D-bag. Besides, what's going to prevent him from killing us to prove to the cops that the cretins who did this to her parents are dead? Don't you think that a show of bravery will be much better for his career than turning over some little girl? Once I talk to her, then we'll decide on step 2. Strangely enough, though this part of our adventure was 100% on his shoulders, Eldritch reluctantly agreed.